Well, it's the new season, and you know what that means. That's right, it's time to ignore all of it and keep talking about Youjo Senki. I've talked about it previously, and you can find links to those videos in the description below, but there's still just so much more I wanted to talk about. The amount of detail that Studio Nut has put into this series is staggering, and it deserves more time in the spotlight. So, here are 12 more awesome details in Youjo Senki. We'll begin with this map of Europe. Let's go through and touch on each of these countries a bit, starting with the enemies to the north, the Entente Alliance, or Scandinavia land. Their flag is kinda weird. It doesn't really look like any of the Scandinavian or Nordic flags, which mostly have a cross design. It looks a bit like the Swedish coat of arms, albeit with 2 moose instead of lions, but it's pretty out there. And, by the way, yes, the plural of moose is moose. It's worth noting in the light novels the region is actually called the Legadonia Federation, but nobody says that name in the anime. Historically, the Entente referred to the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, so maybe it's meant to refer to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden? Confusing the issue further is that the maps in the anime combine the 2 names into the Legadonia Entente Union, and I'll tell you how I know that later in the video. Even more confusing is that in episode 6, Tanya actually calls them the Triple Entente, both in the sub and the dub, but I think that's the only time they refer to them like that, so... The best explanation I can muster is maybe Carlo then decided that Scandinavia would be better represented by a political union of separate states, kinda like Austria and Hungary, rather than one big super country, so they changed it for the anime adaptation, but really, I have no idea, that's a pure guess. Anyway, their flight unit, seen here, has some pretty interesting inspiration for it. Skis have been used by militaries in Northern Europe going all the way back to the 13th century, and it wasn't just some old-timey thing either. Ski infantry actually saw combat all the way up through the Napoleonic Wars and into World War II, where they played a big part in the Norwegian theater. It's a neat cultural pull, and I'm a big fan of how they're animated to look like they are actually skiing around. So, over on the west, we have the Francois Republic, obviously France. Keeping with the weird emblems as flags thing, the Republic's flag seems to be a variant of France's national emblem, with the RF for the République Française replaced with a fleur-de-lis. Their flight unit is a little more generic, calling back to the knights on horseback days of the French Kingdom, perhaps. They do say that the Republic's magic technology is lagging behind the rest of the continents, so maybe that's why their flight units are so big and bulky compared to other nations. Over on the northwest-ish area, we've got the Allied Kingdom. Their flag is a much more obvious variant of the Union Jack, but I can't really tell what the emblem in the middle is. It's pretty small, and this is the best shot I could find. Their flight units are clearly based on the image of witches flying on broomsticks. Now, I don't know if witches are a uniquely British concept, but admit it. When you saw those things, you were like, yo, that's Harry Potter, right? So, aside from those main players, there's also the Unified States of America, which apparently has 16 states, or maybe 17 if the Big Star counts. There's the Rushi Federation, which I think is pronounced that way, which I'd guess has a variant of Russia's coat of arms, but it's hard to tell. And there's the Illoa Kingdom, somewhere around here, but I guess Italy isn't important enough to get a flag. I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of flight units they'll have in Season 2. Maybe the Russians will have some kind of flying mortar and pestle, like Baba Yaga? That'd be neat. As an aside, if you didn't notice, Victoria here is a Russian immigrant whose family fled during the Communist Revolution. That's not a spoiler or anything, the anime just glosses over it. I imagine they'll talk about it more in Season 2. Finally, the Empire. Again, their flag is a variant on a coat of arms, albeit with cool-ass dragons instead of eagles. but it's hard to say which country it's based on exactly. This kind of black eagle crest was used across many different German states, going all the way back to the imperial eagle of the Holy Roman Empire. That said, if I had to pick, it reminds me the most of the German Confederation, which was a political association in the 19th century for the various German states to coordinate their economies. Now, in the real world this institution collapsed due to infighting, but perhaps in Youjo Senki's timeline this confederation progressed into a larger political merger, forming the current empire. That would explain its massive size, as the empire includes all of Prussia, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Now, Prussia and Austria-Hungary were two of the world's great powers all on their own, so it's easy to see why this kind of super Germany would be such a big deal. As for their flight units, they don't seem to be based on anything in particular. I think their compactness is just meant to show the Empire's technological superiority. Instead, I'll just point out that the mage's legs are consistently animated differently. For example, you can see them bracing their bodies on one leg while letting the other droop a bit. Pretty neat. Now, you might have noticed that there's one country that I skipped over here. Good old Dacia. They are based on Romania, and that deserves some special mention. Now, I'm brushing over a ton of backstory here, but the short version is, Romania was scared of Russia, so they sought an alliance with Germany. This was a bit awkward because Germany and Austria-Hungary were friends, but Romania and Austria-Hungary were not friends because many ethnic Romanians were in Hungarian lands, including Transylvania. At the outbreak of World War I, they declared their neutrality, and after lots of debate, they allied themselves with the Triple Entente to make a push into Transylvania to liberate their people. Needless to say, this didn't go well for them, and within 4 months, half of their country was occupied by the Central Powers. So, the fighting wasn't quite as one-sided as Youjo Senki depicted, but it is true that Romania's invasion got pushed back despite a massive numbers advantage. In the real world, France eventually helped them reclaim their territory, but needless to say, that's not going to be happening in this timeline, which is a big deal considering the region's vast natural resources. Alright, enough about countries. How about a mini What's in an OP ripoff? Let's talk about this shot here, because it has a shitload of detail in it. We see two Tanyas in a field of gears, which broadly represent her Type 95 computational jewel, but more specifically represent Being X, who makes it work. And you can see that in how the Tanya in the background is inside one of the gears. X has essentially trapped her with her own cursed weapon. The Tanya in the foreground, however, has escaped the gears, standing boldly in defiance, and both Tanyas are staring straight at the camera. These kinds of fourth wall looks are usually reserved for profile shots, like this shot later in the OP, and in most other shows I'd say it was the same thing here, but Youjo Senki is dealing with a god, or at least a godlike being, that exists beyond the mortal realm. Make no mistake, Tanya has her sights set on her enemy, Being X, and she will not be trapped by his design. Or so she thinks. Look around this shot and you can see she's surrounded by what is probably razor wire, but is blurred enough that it looks maybe a bit like thorns. You know, like the crown of thorns? The reason why I love this shot so much is because it perfectly encapsulates the show's two main characters. Tanya defiantly works against her enemy, Being X, but is sometimes so tunnel-visioned that she can't notice his influence around her. Meanwhile, Being X is rarely seen and isn't in the shot at all, but his presence is felt throughout the entire series, and he is constantly working behind the scenes to keep Tanya trapped in his grand design. Damn, this shot is good. Anyway, I could keep talking about the OP, call me Jeff though, but for now let's move on. And we'll be moving on to the subject of guns. So, see that rifle in Tanya's hands there? Did you know that it's a go. Well, shit. Apparently every person on planet Earth already knew this, but I didn't know this, so here. The Mondragon rifle was designed by Mexican General Manuel Mondragon. The Mexican government contracted SIG, who you might know better as Sig Sauer, to produce 4,000 rifles. Thanks in part to the Mexican Revolution in 1910, only 400 got shipped before the government cancelled the order. At the breakout of World War I, Germany bought the remainder, since they were ostensibly very high-quality rifles, but they had a really bad habit of breaking when exposed to dirt or mud. And keep in mind, World War I was the one with the trenches, which were all dirt and mud. But, you know where it's a lot cleaner? The sky. They got adopted by the German Air Force, and so too by the Imperial Mages, who serve a similar role. I'd talk more about the mechanical parts of the gun, but I'd be outing myself as one of those hippie Canadians who doesn't know shit about guns, so instead I'll defer to the IMFDB, or Internet Movie Firearm Database. It's got you covered on guns, and has what I assume is a pretty good page for Youjo Senki. Although, speaking of guns, let's talk about the fight in episode 11. In it, Colonel Anson Sue here is using a trench gun, specifically a Winchester 1897, which Tanya claims to be a treaty violation, which has some interesting backstory to it. When the US entered World War I, they brought trench guns with them, and while they weren't too hot at a distance, in the close quarters combat of the trenches, they could be devastatingly effective. So much so, in fact, that the German government protested their use. They claimed that trench guns were a violation of the Hague Convention because they caused unnecessary suffering, and threatened to execute any American soldiers found carrying them. The US responded by saying, "Nah, you're stupid, you have no legal basis. If you execute any of our soldiers for this, we'll execute any Germans we find carrying flamethrowers." Bluff apparently called, both sides dropped the issue. So, while Tanya isn't technically correct, her bias is historically accurate. Moving away from guns, but still kinda in the realm of weapons, we have the V1. The Vergeltungswaffe, or Vengeance Weapon, was an unmanned flying bomb used by Germany in World War II to bomb London. The V1 in Youjo Senki, on the other hand, was used on the Francois Republic, is in fact manned, and is a bomb in only the most metaphorical sense. But the basic idea of using a hydrogen engine to propel a payload too fast and too high to be intercepted effectively remains the same. That being said, you might have noticed that Youjo Senki's V1 has 5 rockets on the back instead of just 1. Dr. Shugel explains that his V1 has a multi-stage design, to purge the extra rockets once they're out of fuel to increase their top speed. So, I should mention here that I suspect Dr. Shugel is at least partially based on Werner von Braun, the aerospace engineer that designed the V2 for Germany, as well as the Saturn series of rockets for America. The Saturn series used the same multi-stage rocket booster setup on a much larger scale to achieve spaceflight, which makes Shugel's designs pretty damn impressive considering they're 4 decades ahead of time. Oh, and while I'm talking about it, they also broke the sound barrier 22 years faster than Chuck Yeager and the Bell X-1. But I guess that's all fair considering Shugel has literally divine inspiration. Next, one thing I really want to talk about is the writing. And not the story writing, I mean the actual text you see in the background sometimes. It may surprise you to know that that isn't just gibberish. Those are actual words, just written in a fake alphabet. So, I went through the series, doing the best I could with the context that I had, and wound up with this cipher. There's a couple of characters missing, and you'll have to forgive my lack of cartographic skills, but it should be mostly readable, and I've made sure to link this image in the description. Also, if anyone with real art skills wants to make a better version of this, I'll make sure to link that as well. Assuming you don't feel like sifting through text on your own time, here's an example, using this nice, full letter that Tanya writes in episode 3. Fully transcribed, it reads something like this. You can pause the video if you want to read the whole thing, but in case you're curious, A commissariat is a department for the supply of food and equipment. Subaltern is an antiquated term for a second lieutenant, and a Cruskos is whatever the hell this thing is. Needless to say, the grammar is a bit off, even setting aside that it's in English and not in German, but I guess they weren't expecting a Giga nerd to go combing through individual frames to translate their fake alphabet, so fair enough. Basically, yo, Studio Nut, hit me up, I'll totally make the background text for Season 2 for you, free of charge. Anyway, there's lots of neat bits of info you can glean if you go looking for it. I mentioned the Legadonia Entente Union earlier in the video, and you can see that on the maps. You can also see that the Allied Kingdom is called Commonwealth, and the Empire is just Vaterland, or Fatherland. Oh, and here's a fun game for you viewers. There's a spelling mistake on this page. Let me know if you can find it, cause it sure messed with my head when I was making my cipher. All in all, you can tell they put a crazy amount of work into these tiny details that 99% of people will never look at. Right down to nitty-gritty stuff like this fancy font that they use on that cafe sign in the background, versus this letter which was clearly handwritten. It's exactly this type of detail that I love to see in media, and a big part of why I wanted to make another video on the subject. Finally, the last detail I want to point out is that in episode 7, when Tanya is pondering the details of their invasion of the Entente, her hair makes a question mark. I don't have anything to add to that, it's just cute as hell. And that covers it. Now, I know, I didn't cover everything. I mean, I didn't even talk about these boats. You know they took an entire week off just to animate these boats, which show up for like 2 minutes? Studio Nut is crazy, man. Nuts, even. Anyway, I talked about Studio Nut a lot, but the original author, Carlo Zen, deserves a lot of respect as well. And if you want to support him, the light novels have been licensed by Yen Press, with the first volume coming out on November 14th. I highly recommend anyone who loves the series to check them out. Meanwhile, if you want to support me, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video, subscribed, and especially let me know what you thought. I'm always eager to read you guys' comments. Anyway, this is Golden Battler, signing out. See you next time.